Lightning tore across the night sky, illuminating wet pavement stretching through an industrial part of the city. Rain battered the rooftops, flowing in small rivers down clogged gutters. Few people dared remain outside in such weather, and those who did dashed from one awning to another, umbrellas turned useless by the howling wind. In the midst of this ferocity, a solitary figure walked with measured caution, wearing a threadbare winter coat whose collar had come undone. His name was Harold Renshaw, though it had been quite some time since anyone cared to address him by name. People in the community had seen him around but never bothered to learn the details of his life. Some called him that homeless man by the old grocery store. Others referred to him in whispered tones, that guy with the cardboard sign. But Harold refused to shrink to that identity alone. Though outwardly he might look beaten by life's challenges, face weathered, hair in disarray, hands calloused, he carried a kernel of dignity that nothing, not even life on the street, had managed to tear from him. Tonight, however, the weather had conspired with his physical exhaustion. Sharp pangs in his ribs reminded him he hadn't eaten a proper meal in days. Shelter was nowhere close at hand, and every step seemed to weigh more heavily than the last. One foot after another, Harold marched on, searching for even the most meager overhang to protect him from the stinging rain. He clutched a plastic bag of his few possessions, a tattered photograph of his late mother, a worn paperback mystery novel missing its last chapter, and a half-eaten energy bar. A few coins jingled in his coat pocket, almost useless in a city too large for small change to matter. As thunder rumbled overhead, Harold slowed his pace, spotting a car parked along the side of the road. Its hazard lights glowed orange in the gloom. The front left tire had collapsed into a pancake, flattened entirely, and a tall silhouette of a woman hovered near it, fumbling with an unfamiliar lug wrench under a feeble street lamp. She was soaked through, her coat plastered to her body by sheets of relentless rain. Harold's first instinct was caution. He had known too many unkind reactions from strangers. But another instinct, deeper and more powerful, tugged at him: empathy. The woman was clearly in trouble. He didn't want to leave her stranded. He took a few tentative steps forward, his voice scratchy from lack of use. "Ma'am, you need help?" The words nearly vanished amid the wind. The woman didn't hear him and continued trying to position the wrench over a stubborn lug nut. Harold ventured closer and cleared his throat. She jumped at the sight of him, soaked, exhausted, wearing an old coat. Through the streaks of rain on her face, he saw her expression shift from fear to embarrassment. I'm sorry. You startled me," she managed, trying to speak above the pounding rain. Her name, though Harold did not yet know it, was Mara Larson. She was a self-made professional, a real estate agent with a strong sense of loyalty to her clients. She prided herself on self-reliance. Stranded as she was, though, she was grateful for any help, even from a stranger. "It's okay," Harold said softly. "Didn't mean to scare you. You need a hand with the tire." Mara nodded, still taken aback by the sudden offer. Part of her mind flickered with warnings, especially as a woman alone on a stormy street with a man she didn't know. But something about Harold's eyes, a warm sincerity that cut through the gloom, put her at ease. Yes, I'm trying to change it, but the jack is giving me trouble. And I can't get this last nut off." Harold approached carefully, well aware of the boundaries. He gently nudged the jack to verify it was seated under the correct spot on the car frame. "May I?" he asked, gesturing to take the wrench from her. She handed it over. It was cold to the touch, icy even, but he braced himself, inhaled, and gave a firm twist. The lug nut refused to budge. Another try, summoning a bit more strength, and it gave a sharp screech as it turned. He nodded, satisfied. The rain intensified, drenching them both. Mara could hardly see, her hair plastered to her forehead. Nonetheless, she noticed Harold was shivering, possibly more than she was. "Let me pop the trunk and get an umbrella," she offered, but he shook his head. "By the time you find it, we'll be done," he said, forcing a smile. He tried to position his body so that his back shielded her somewhat from the wind. Mara watched in awe. He worked as if he had changed thousands of tires in his day, though the chill in the air clearly pierced his coat, leaving him trembling. She wanted to ask him if he was all right, but the storm's racket swallowed her words. Instead, she hastily opened the trunk, retrieved a spare tire, and rolled it to him. He accepted it and maneuvered it into place. All the while, thunder boomed overhead as lightning continued to tear the sky in half. They were, in every sense, two strangers in the night, one refined in her professional life, the other grappling with the fringes of society. Yet, for these few minutes, they were united by something so simple, the desire to fix a problem in the middle of a storm. After several more lug nuts clanged free and rolled to the asphalt, the old tire was off. Harold lifted the spare into position and tightened the nuts meticulously, waiting until the vehicle was secure. "All done," he said, pressing his hands to his back as he stood upright. His knees wobbled slightly. Mara was shivering, arms clasped around herself. "Thank you," she said between shaking breaths. "I'd be here all night if you hadn't come along." Harold shrugged, attempting to downplay his own noble act. "It's no trouble." But it was trouble. He'd expended what precious little energy he had left. He felt an odd swirl in his stomach, relief at having helped, overshadowed by the persistent pang of hunger. The momentary brightness that had alighted in his spirit during the act of service faltered as soon as the job was done. Now the question loomed, where would he seek shelter in the biting cold? A part of Mara wanted to invite him to warm up in her car. Something kept her from speaking the invitation aloud. Was it fear, caution, or the swirl of adrenaline still coursing through her from being stranded? She rummaged through her purse, searching for money to hand him as a thank you, only to find she'd left most of her cash at home. All she had were a few loose bills and a scattering of coins. She pressed the meager wad of bills into his hand. "I'm sorry, I don't have more," she said, voice faltering. Harold glanced at it, feeling a mixture of gratitude and shame. Part of him wanted to hand it back, pride always lurked within him, but the reality of his situation was undeniable. "It's all right," he said. This is a big help." They stood there, the driver's side door still open, engine idling. Harold took a half step backward, not wanting to intrude further. Lightning flashed, illuminating his face for the briefest moment. Mara saw the hollowness in his cheeks, the weariness in his eyes, and a wave of compassion nearly overwhelmed her. "Do you need a ride anywhere?" she asked, unsure if that was even feasible at this late hour. He shook his head, though inside he was waging a silent debate. "Yes, I need a ride. Yes, I need a place to stay. Yes, I'm starving." But accepting rides from strangers rarely ended well, and he was reluctant to put her in an awkward spot. "I'll manage," he finally said. "Thank you, though. You'd best get going before the storm gets worse." Mara hesitated. She felt an inexplicable bond with him, having been saved from hours of misery. Yet she couldn't find the words to extend further help. The thunder cracked again, prompting her to close the door in a hurry. She rolled down the passenger side window a fraction. "Thank you again," she called out. "Be safe, please." He gave a small nod, turning away as she merged back onto the road. The headlights disappeared, leaving him alone beneath the sputtering street lamp. Rain hammered on. For a while, Harold stood there, letting the downpour soak him thoroughly, silent and pensive. Somewhere along this stretch of city blocks, he knew of a hidden awning near an old theater that might keep him somewhat dry. He trudged forward, one soggy step after another, the bills she had given him tucked carefully inside his coat pocket. The gratitude he felt was tempered by the exhaustion in his bones. He wondered if he would wake the next day with enough strength to continue. But he pressed on anyway, determined in small ways, carrying that faint spark of dignity. Across the city, Mara drove with defrosters blasting, her heart still pounding. She was grateful for the tall stranger with the gentle eyes and the steady hands. There was something about him, some intangible sorrow behind his gaze, that unsettled her. She thought about the money she had given him. It wasn't enough to do anything more than buy a single meal, perhaps. She felt an ache in her chest, as if she had left a kindness unfinished. But the storm demanded her attention, forcing her to keep both hands on the wheel and her eyes forward on the road. By the time she reached her apartment complex, her mind was swirling with uneasy thoughts of the man she had left behind. Neither of them realized that tonight, on this storm-lashed street, the seeds of an extraordinary change had been planted. Neither knew that in less than 24 hours, their lives would become irrevocably linked by an act of gratitude and generosity far greater than either could imagine. Outside, the wind whipped through the city canyons, carrying the faint echoes of chance encounters and the possibility that, sometimes, one small act of help can shift the entire axis of a life. Mara awoke to beams of sunlight filtering through her curtains. The storm had passed, leaving a crisp air that smelled of pavement scrubbed clean. She lay in bed, replaying the previous night in her mind. The risk she had taken being out so late in such a part of town. The kindness of that stranger who appeared out of the darkness to fix her flat tire. She was supposed to have a busy schedule, 2 property showings, a meeting with a potential client, and errands that had been delayed by last night's fiasco. It took several minutes before she found the energy to swing her legs over the edge of the bed. Her eyes landed on the clock. She was already 30 minutes behind schedule. Scrambling into a quick shower, she let the hot water remind her how fortunate she was to have basic comforts. The thought of the man, Harold, somewhere out there without a roof, haunted her. She tried to dismiss the concerns as she selected her outfit, a sensible skirt suit in a soft, neutral color and ready to pot of coffee. She had more pressing matters, she told herself. Yet while sipping her coffee, she found herself pacing the kitchen. She could not ignore the memory of his trembling hands, the quiet dignity with which he'd refused additional aid. She recalled his soaked hair flopping over his forehead, rivulets of water dripping down. The mental image was so powerful it brought a fresh wave of concern. In a sudden burst of resolve, Mara made a decision. She would try to find him. Maybe she could provide something more: warm clothes, groceries, a chance at a shower, or at the very least a proper meal. She glanced at her watch. Her first showing was in 2 hours. She could attempt the route from last night and search for him in the early morning hush. It was a long shot. In a city this size, a single person could vanish with ease. But she had to try. She grabbed her purse, her keys, and a heavy coat just in case the weather turned again. Carefully, she eased out of the apartment complex parking lot. The roads were glistening from the downpour, but the sun's gentle warmth promised a day that would soon dry everything up. She headed toward the industrial district, retracing the path she had taken home. On a typical day, she would never venture into these parts unless she had a reason, perhaps a property to show or a client meeting. Now she was here for something else entirely. Driving at a snail's pace, she scanned the sidewalks, alleys, and any gathering spots where a homeless man might spend the night. She couldn't recall the exact block where her tire had failed, but she recognized certain signposts. There was the old electronics store with a rusted sign out front. There was the abandoned lot with waist-high grass. She turned down side streets, half expecting to see him huddled beneath some overhang or rummaging through trash bins. But there was no sign of Harold. Instead, she spotted a few other souls carrying plastic bags or pushing grocery carts filled with their worldly possessions. She hesitated, uncertain how they might react if a random stranger pulled up and started asking questions. Still, her desire to find him outweighed her discomfort. She rolled down her window near a group of 3 individuals, all of them wrapped in mismatched clothes that gave away their unfortunate circumstances. "Excuse me," she called out gently, "I'm looking for someone who was around here last night." A man tall, maybe in his early 50s, with a short beard, wearing an old trench coat. "Does that ring a bell?" They eyed her warily. One shrugged, another shook his head in disinterest. The third, an older woman with a stooped posture, raised a hand. "You mean Harold?" she asked. "He's not always around, but he was here last night, I think." Mara felt a flutter of hope. "Yes, I believe his name was Harold. He helped me fix my tire." "Do you know where he might have gone?" The older woman frowned in thought. "He usually drifts. Sometimes near the old theater on Cardigan Street. There's an awning there that's a bit warmer. Other times he goes to the second-hand bookstore on the corner when it opens, looking for freebies or a quiet place to sit." "Hard to say." "Thank you," Mara replied, offering a small wave. She handed them a few small bills out of gratitude, which they accepted. She then followed the lead, heading for Cardigan Street. The old theater loomed at the intersection, a vestige from a bygone era with chipped paint on the marquee. She slowed, seeing a narrow alley that ran behind it. Her heart quickened. Stepping out of her car, she walked cautiously along the alley. The smell of stale cigarettes mingled with the lingering dampness from the storm. "Harold," she called out, voice echoing slightly off the brick walls. She almost felt foolish. Was she expecting him to just pop out from behind a dumpster? Instead, she found only an empty stretch of concrete. A ragged cardboard box, flattened and waterlogged, lay abandoned by a service door. No sign of him. Disappointed, she headed back to her car. A glance at her watch told her she was running dangerously close to the time of her first real estate appointment. With a heavy sigh, she pulled away, unsure if she would find him at all. Meanwhile, Harold woke from a fitful sleep. The place he had managed to stay the night was not the old theater but a small covered stairwell behind a vacant office building. Though it offered partial shelter from the rain, the ground had still been damp and frigid, leaving him stiff and achy. His mind was filled with fleeting images of the previous night, the woman's face, the gratitude in her eyes, and the meager bills she had pressed into his hand. He rubbed at his eyes, sitting up. A dog barked somewhere in the distance. Daylight peeked around the edges of the building, and that meant it was time to move. Prolonged presence on private property often led to confrontations with security or the police. So he gathered his plastic bag of belongings and shuffled down the alley, each footstep sending a ripple of discomfort up his spine. The coins in his pocket jingled softly, reminding him that he now had enough for a small breakfast if he found an inexpensive diner. Despite his rough existence, Harold kept a certain routine. He disliked begging for money. Instead, he tried to do odd jobs wherever he could. He had enough skill with his hands to fix minor things or help with carrying deliveries or even paint over graffiti for small businesses, anything that earned him enough to get by. It was through that same sense of pride that he had offered to change Mara's tire. He never wanted to be a beggar or a burden, and last night's chance to help had given him a sense of purpose he rarely felt anymore. He turned onto a main thoroughfare where early morning workers bustled in and out of coffee shops. Business-suited men and women gave him sidelong glances as he passed, some suspicious, others indifferent. Occasionally, a mother hurrying her child to daycare tightened her grip on the child's hand when Harold walked by. Though he understood the caution, it still stung. He brushed it aside mentally, just another day on the street. Finding a small diner with a breakfast special, $3.99 sign in the window, Harold entered, removing his cap out of courtesy. The hostess looked at him, at first uncertain whether to seat him or turn him away. But he fished out the small bills that Mara had given him, brandishing them gently as if to say, "Yes, I can pay." Reluctantly, the hostess led him to a corner booth away from the main crowd. The seat's final covering was torn in places and the overhead lamp flickered. He was just grateful to be in a warm place with the prospect of a hot meal. He ordered scrambled eggs, toast, and a cup of coffee. When the plate arrived, the smell of butter and warm bread nearly made him dizzy with anticipation. He hadn't eaten this well in days, and each bite ignited his taste buds. As he chewed, the tension in his shoulders eased, if only for a few minutes. While he ate, Harold's eyes drifted to a small television mounted in a corner near the ceiling, broadcasting the morning news. It was a standard reel, local officials discussing street repairs, then a segment on rising real estate prices, and a feel-good story about volunteers cleaning up a community park. He sipped his coffee slowly, letting the warmth settle in his chest. If only, he thought, the rest of life's problems could be fixed as easily as a flat tire. By the time Mara was concluding her first property tour, a suburban home that needed a bit of updating, her mind was only half on her work. She stepped into each room, rattled off facts about square footage, the condition of the roofing, the potential for renovations, but her thoughts kept drifting back to the tall, thin figure who'd come to her rescue. She mused about the possibility of seeing him again, but the city was vast. The memory of his eyes haunted her, an unspoken pain, years of struggle glimpsed in a single glance. Outside, the morning had grown bright. She waved farewell to the prospective buyers, plastering on the polite smile that was part of her professional demeanor. As soon as they drove off, she let the smile fade. A restlessness stirred within her. The next showing wasn't for another couple of hours, leaving her a gap of free time. She decided to use it. Emboldened, she climbed into her sedan and set off again, forging a plan to check a local homeless shelter on the edge of downtown. Even if Harold didn't frequent that shelter, maybe someone there would know him. Her phone buzzed with calls and text messages from colleagues and clients, but she silenced it for the moment. She was on a mission. As she navigated the congested streets, she recalled the hostess at that tiny diner near the old post office. Maybe he could have gone there for breakfast. She reasoned it was worth a try, so she changed lanes and headed for that district, adrenaline thrumming in her veins. She pushed open the diner door about 40 minutes after Harold had finished his breakfast and left. The hostess, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes, squinted as Mara entered. "Morning. Table for one?" Mara shook her head politely. "No, thank you. I'm actually looking for someone." Tall, older man with a bit of a beard, likely wearing a worn trench coat. "Maybe he came in earlier." The hostess pursed her lips. "We get a lot of folks." Her tone suggested mild annoyance, but then she softened. "Yes, a man like that came in not long ago. Sat in the corner, had some eggs, coffee." Mara felt a flicker of hope. "Did he say where he was going?" The hostess shrugged. "He didn't really chat, though he seemed polite enough. Tipped $1 on a $3 breakfast special, so I suppose he was grateful. You might check up the block." He walked out that way. Mara thanked her and hurried back to her car, scanning the sidewalk. It was a hive of pedestrians, office workers, retirees out for a stroll, couriers with packages in tow. The hope that Harold would still be lingering evaporated as she realized it was nearly impossible to pick out one man in the swirl of bodies. Still, she refused to give up. She spent another 30 minutes driving around, peering down alleys, glancing at benches in small parks. Nothing. Frustration mounted. In the end, she had to concede that she might not find him this morning. Her phone rang again, a reminder of her professional obligations. She couldn't blow off the entire day. "Perhaps I'm being foolish," she thought. "I tried, right?" But even as she tried to talk herself into letting it go, she felt a pang of guilt. This man had saved her from a terrifying night, and she couldn't let that go unacknowledged. She resolved to keep trying whenever she could. Someone, somewhere, had to know where Harold spent his time. Meanwhile, Harold felt a small measure of contentment after his warm breakfast. He spent part of the day searching for odd jobs, meandering through neighborhoods, occasionally stumbling upon potential leads. At a small hardware store, he noticed the proprietor standing outside, frowning at a broken wooden crate in front of his display window. Harold offered to haul it away in exchange for a few bucks. The owner agreed. Harold's back ached from lugging the waterlogged wood, but he felt a morsel of dignity at earning money rather than asking for handouts. That afternoon, the sun shone strongly, drying the sidewalks from the prior night's deluge. Harold found himself near a park with a small pond. The green grass and budding flowers reminded him of simpler times, some ephemeral, half-remembered era before everything fell apart. He looked around carefully, found an unoccupied bench, and sat down, resting his weary legs. He rummaged through his plastic bag, removing the battered paperback mystery novel. It was missing its final chapter, something that had tormented him for weeks. He'd found the book abandoned in a bus station, and though the story enthralled him, the missing pages meant he never knew how it ended. Perhaps he'd never find out. Yet he turned the pages anyway, escaping his reality if only for a few minutes. Across the street, a well-dressed woman emerged from a taxi, scanning the horizon. Mara. She had arrived for an afternoon showing at a condo near the park. Although her professional smile was firmly in place, her eyes wandered. She was still looking, always searching. She did not spot him, nor he her. The two were separated by just a few hundred yards of green lawn and city traffic, yet they might as well have been miles apart. As Mara guided her clients toward the condo's front steps, she felt a nagging compulsion to look toward the park. She paused momentarily, scanning the park benches. People in bright clothing jogged by. A few mothers stood watch over children playing near the pond, but she saw no tall figure in a threadbare trench coat. The moment passed, and she continued with her showing, unaware of how close she had come. Harold, oblivious to her presence, remained immersed in the incomplete story, oblivious to how entwined his own story was becoming with hers. Though the day carried on quietly, each of them was on a separate track, one step away from an encounter that might change everything. Meanwhile, the sun dipped lower, casting elongated shadows across the city streets. A warm glow replaced the earlier gloom. And in this half-light, the seeds of Mara's determination and Harold's quiet persistence continued to germinate, setting the stage for the remarkable events soon to unfold. As evening approached, Mara sat at her kitchen table, tapping her fingers anxiously against its surface. The hum of her refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic were the only noises breaking the apartment's stillness. She had tried, repeatedly, to keep her mind on her work, but her thoughts circled back to Harold and his unknown whereabouts. She found herself opening her laptop, searching local news for any mention of homeless outreach programs or local charities. If he had been in the city for a while, perhaps he'd come into contact with these organizations. Outreach World, describing the man who had helped her, urging anyone with information to get in touch. She hit send, unaware that this single email would have far-reaching consequences that would soon unite strangers and spark an extraordinary act of kindness. One she couldn't even imagine. And in the next 48 hours, a dramatic moment would finally bring her face-to-face with Harold in a way neither expected. When Mara woke the following morning, she was unprepared for the flood of email notifications that lit up her phone. She'd expected maybe 1 or 2 replies from the mass email. Instead, her inbox was teeming with messages from realtors, property managers, charitable organizations, and even everyday citizens offering tips or well-wishes. One message caught her eye. Subject: searching for Harold. From email protected to email protected. Mara, I might know who you're talking about. A tall homeless man named Harold was recently spotted working with Lens Landscaping. My cousin does deliveries in that area and saw him unloading sod. Not sure if it's the same Harold, but thought you should know. Cynthia R. Mara's heart skipped a beat. She hurriedly typed a response. Thank you so much, Cynthia. Could you send me any details on Lens Landscaping? Address? Phone number? Etc.? She hit send, her fingers trembling. If Harold had found work, that was wonderful news. But how long would he be there, and would she be able to locate him? She paced her kitchen, nibbling on a piece of toast. Her phone chimed again. A new reply from Cynthia with the address. A quick search on her phone showed it was in an industrial district not too far from her office. She quickly changed into a business-casual outfit, throwing a blazer over a simple top. She had to balance her professional obligations and her personal quest, but she was determined to chase this lead. Within the hour, Mara drove to the address she'd found. A chain-link fence bore a modest sign reading, Lens Landscaping. She pulled into a small gravel lot. The early morning sun glinted off piles of sod and landscaping equipment scattered around. She saw a handful of men loading a truck, but none looked like the tall figure she remembered. A stocky man in stained jeans strolled over, wiping his brow with a bandana. Morning, he said. Can I help you? Hi, Mara said, heart pounding in her chest. I'm looking for someone named Harold. I heard he might be working here. The man smirked. You must be looking for the new guy. He's not in yet. Starts at 6 most days, but sometimes he gets here a bit later. He extended a hand. Name's Len. I run this place. Mara took his hand, shaking it carefully. I'm Mara. I'm a friend of Harold's, sort of. Len eyed her, curiosity evident. He doesn't strike me as the type who's got many friends in fancy business suits. But I'm not one to pry. If you stick around, maybe he'll show. She felt her cheeks flush. I'm willing to wait. She glanced at her watch. 7:15 a.m. Where could Harold be? Len shrugged. He's usually here by now. Could be he's running late or maybe he got some other job. Hard to say. Deflation set in. She forced a polite smile. I don't want to disrupt your work, but if you see him, please let him know Mara was here. I'd really like to talk to him. Sure, Len replied, sounding non-committal. I'll mention it if he comes around. Mara slipped a business card from her blazer pocket and handed it over. Here's my number. If you or Harold could call me, I'd be grateful. Len took the card, tucking it into his shirt pocket. Will do. She thanked him and walked back to her car, disappointment pressing down on her. She glanced around one last time before heading off. A stinging thought buzzed in her mind. What if I missed him by minutes? Her schedule was packed, so she couldn't stake out the place all day. She decided to return later or possibly the next day, on the chance Harold might appear. As she drove away, she cursed the city's unpredictability. Yet, unbeknownst to Mara, Harold was already en route, delayed by an unexpected confrontation that morning in a different part of town. One that would not only make him late for work, but set off an emotional chain reaction. And as circumstances spiraled, the question would no longer be whether Mara could find him. It would be whether Harold could hold onto the fragile progress he'd made. That morning, Harold had awakened late in the hostel, exhausted from the previous day's labor. By the time he realized it was 6:30 a.m., panic seized him. He rushed through a quick rinse in the communal bathroom, grabbed his belongings and sprinted outside. The bus route near the hostel might get him closer to Len's landscaping, but the next bus wasn't due for another 15 minutes. He weighed his options. Wait for the bus or try to walk fast, possibly jog. The bus might be more reliable. As he stood at the bus stop, rummaging through his pockets for change, he realized he barely had enough for the fare. Just then, an SUV pulled up to the curb. The passenger side window rolled down, revealing a face that made Harold's breath catch in his throat. Jeremy, a man from Harold's past, the last person he wanted to see. Jeremy was an old acquaintance from Harold's construction days, but the relationship had soured when they both got laid off. Jeremy had turned to small-time hustling to make ends meet, while Harold refused to join in any criminal endeavors. Over time, Jeremy developed a cold disregard for Harold's moral stance, branding him a fool for choosing poverty over easy but illicit money. "Harold," Jeremy said, voice dripping with condescension. "Fancy seeing you here. Heard you were on the streets. Looks like that's true." Harold felt a chill run down his spine. "I'm busy, Jeremy," he said, stepping back from the curb. He had no desire to rekindle this toxic acquaintance. Jeremy leaned over the passenger seat. "Look, man, you and I go way back. I got opportunities now, good money. You know you can't keep living like this. Why not hop in? We'll talk." Harold shook his head firmly. "No, I'm not interested in your opportunities. You know that." Jeremy's eyes hardened. Still the same old Harold, too proud to join the winning side. "Suit yourself." He tossed a small business card out the window. It fluttered to the pavement near Harold's feet. "If you change your mind, call me. Life doesn't have to be so hard, you know?" The SUV sped off, leaving a cloud of exhaust. Harold kicked the card aside with disgust. The bus arrived shortly after, and he climbed aboard, heart still hammering. He hated the reminder of how close he could be to slipping into a life of crime or moral compromise. It took all his will to maintain his sense of right and wrong, even in the depths of desperation. When he arrived at Len's Landscaping, it was nearly 8 a.m., far later than planned. He hurried through the gate, breathless, searching for Len. A couple of workers eyed him with curiosity, but nobody greeted him. Finally, he spotted Len near a stack of PVC pipes. "You're late," Len barked, crossing his arms. Harold held up his palms in apology. "I'm sorry. I had." Len cut him off. "Look, I told you we start at 6. I got a schedule to keep. The crew already left for today's jobs." Harold's eyes fell. "I'm sorry," he repeated. "I'll catch up. I can grab a cab." "And pay with what?" "Listen, buddy, I gave you a shot. You pulled 2 good days, but if I can't rely on you, I can't keep you. Panic engulfed Harold. Please, I promise it won't happen again. Len shook his head, pulling Mara's business card from his pocket. You just missed a lady looking for you. Seemed real anxious. But I can't babysit your personal life. You want a second chance, prove it tomorrow early. Understood. Harold swallowed hard, nodding. Yes, I'll be here. Len grunted. We'll see. Now get out of here. We got no work for you today. With that, the man stormed off, leaving Harold clutching at the fence, battling a rush of despair. He had come so close to turning things around. One slip up, and it felt like it might all unravel. He stared at the small scrap of paper in Len's wake, wishing he'd had a chance to meet whoever had come asking for him. He recognized the faint swirl of guilt and frustration in his gut, the notion that he was his own worst enemy. But he refused to wallow. Instead, he squared his shoulders. If he had no work today, he'd find some other way to keep moving forward. He'd show up twice as early tomorrow, no matter what it took. He left the landscaping lot, not realizing Mara had been there mere minutes before. The promise of that card, her contact information, remained hidden in Len's pocket, an opportunity waiting to be revealed. Unseen forces were colliding. Mara's unwavering determination, Harold's fragile path to recovery, and the lurking presence of Jeremy's shady influence. The next time these elements crossed paths, the outcome could shatter everything, or lead to an unexpected triumph beyond anyone's reckoning. Later that day, Mara was in her office when she received a phone call from an unknown number. Hoping it was Harold, she answered on the second ring. Mara speaking. Hello, Ms. Larson? Came a raspy voice. This is Carl, Michelle's cousin. I heard from someone at the community center that Harold might be working at Len's Landscaping. Mara brightened. I know. I went there this morning, but I missed him. Carl let out a low chuckle. Well, at least we know he's around. Thing is, I also heard rumor he might need a place soon. Word on the street is he's trying to straighten out his life, maybe even get stable housing. I know it's a long shot, but you're in real estate. Maybe you can help. A thrill coursed through Mara. Place. A home. Could she do that for Harold? It seemed almost too big, too extraordinary. But the notion refused to let go. It's complicated, she said carefully. But maybe. I'm not sure how these things work from a legal standpoint, but I can look into low-income properties or transitional housing. Carl sighed. Yeah, the red tape is always thick. But if he had a sponsor or someone willing to co-sign, it might speed things up. Anyway, I figured I'd mention it. No pressure. They ended the call, leaving Mara's thoughts spiraling. A sponsor or a co-signer, she recalled how some realtors sometimes brokered philanthropic deals, like a donation of property to a charity that manages transitional housing. But that usually required major donors or a large philanthropic organization. She closed her eyes, remembering Harold's kindness and the raw vulnerability she saw in him. Then, a wild idea sparked in her mind. What if I just bought a small property myself? But that was insane. She was a successful realtor, yes, but not wealthy enough to casually buy a house. Mortgage obligations, property taxes, maintenance. The list of complications was endless. Yet the idea took root. She recalled a particular property that had been sitting on the market for ages. An older, single-story home in a modest neighborhood, priced much lower than the city average. It needed substantial repairs, which deterred most buyers. The owners were eager to sell, possibly open to a deal. Could she do it? Shaking off the notion as sheer fantasy, Mara went back to her client files. But the thought would not stay buried. Over and over, the image returned. Harold with a set of keys to a place he could finally call home. As Mara wrestled with the seed of that outrageous plan, Harold spent the afternoon wandering the city, searching for odd jobs, feeling the sting of missed opportunity. Neither knew that a sudden rush of events was about to turn that seed of an idea into a real, if risky, plan. One that would unite not just Mara and Harold, but an entire community in an extraordinary act of compassion. Over the next few days, Mara continued her normal duties, showing properties, handling paperwork, and negotiating deals. But behind the scenes, she pursued that unshakable idea. She discreetly reached out to the owners of that dilapidated single-story home, testing the waters on a potential purchase. To her surprise, the owners expressed willingness to negotiate a very favorable price, eager to offload the property. Daniel noticed Mara's unusual distraction. "You're not normally this absent-minded," he teased gently over lunch one day. "What's up?" Mara glanced around the bustling sandwich shop before leaning in. "I might be doing something unusual," she said. "I'm thinking about buying a small house for Harold." Daniel's mouth fell open. "You mean like giving it to him outright?" "I don't know," Mara said, voice hushed. "Maybe. It needs repairs, though, so it's not move-in ready. But I can't shake the feeling that this is the right thing to do. He helped me in my time of need, and he's clearly trying to get back on his feet." Daniel set down his sandwich, searching her face. "It's a beautiful gesture, but you have to be careful. A deed to a house is no small matter." "I know," she whispered, "but I've run the numbers. It's within reach if I use some of my savings for a down payment. I just need to be sure it won't backfire on him or me." Daniel considered the complexities. What if he can't maintain it or pay utilities? Would you just keep paying? Mara sighed. "That's part of why the place needs repairs. Maybe volunteers can help fix it up, make it more energy efficient. If I can rally enough people from the community, possibly we can transform it into something sustainable." Daniel's eyes lit with cautious optimism. "It sounds like a big project, but maybe others would help if they knew the story. Harold's obviously left an impression. If you could gather volunteers, maybe even fundraise for renovation costs." A spark flared in Mara's heart. Yes, community effort. Everyone who Harold has helped, or who believes in second chances, could pitch in. "I don't have it all figured out, but I'm going to try." That afternoon, Mara quietly began sending inquiries to her network, inquiring about donations or volunteer labor. She explained the idea without naming Harold yet, referencing a homeless individual who showed extraordinary kindness. The response was surprisingly positive. People offered small amounts of money or leftover construction materials, painting supplies, and even their personal labor. Simultaneously, Mara planned to keep searching for Harold, wanting to let him know. She couldn't just spring a house on him without his consent or involvement. But first, she needed some solid progress before approaching him. She also feared scaring him away. She had no clue how he might react to such a massive gesture. While Mara's plan gathered momentum, Harold found himself drifting further from contact. Len was still willing to give him work, but tensions rose each time Harold was even slightly tardy or otherwise compromised by the unpredictability of street life. Would Harold's luck run out before Mara could finalize her plan? Or would a twist of fate bring them together at the perfect time? It was a cold, drizzly Saturday morning when Harold rushed to meet Len's crew yet again. He arrived by 5:30 a.m. this time, determined not to repeat the previous mistake. Len grunted in approval. "Get in the truck. We gotta be at the job site early." Harold hopped in, noting Mike and another worker, Troy, sitting up front. The ride was spent in silence. Soon they pulled up to a large, overgrown property. The client wanted the land cleared for a new commercial development, so the crew set to work uprooting shrubs, removing debris, and leveling the uneven ground. By midday, Harold was drenched in sweat, his hands blistered, but he pushed on, fueled by the desire to keep this job. While hauling a heavy trash bin, he noticed a black SUV idling on the opposite side of the lot. A dark dread flickered in his stomach. Could it be Jeremy again? He forced himself to ignore it. He had no time for that nonsense. Moments later, Troy approached him. "Yo, that SUV's creeping me out. You know those guys?" Harold shrugged, playing dumb. "No idea. Let's just keep working." But as the day wore on, the SUV remained parked, occasionally rolling forward or back as if tracking their movements. Harold's nerves were on edge, and by late afternoon, he could feel eyes watching him. Finally, as he carried a sack of gravel, the SUV's window rolled down, revealing Jeremy's smirking face. He shouted something at Harold, but the machinery's noise drowned it out. Harold pretended not to notice, continuing to work until Len signaled it was time to pack up. Once the crew was back at the truck, Harold risked a glance over his shoulder. Jeremy was leaning against the SUV, lighting a cigarette, staring right at him. Harold ducked into the truck, heart hammering. Len barked, "Who's that guy?" Harold shook his head. "No one, just a troublemaker." The ride back to the landscaping lot was tense. Harold felt as if something was unraveling, a fragile thread about to snap. By the time they arrived, he was anxious to slip away before Jeremy could follow him. However, as he stepped onto the sidewalk outside the chain-link fence, the SUV reappeared. Jeremy called out, "Harold, get in. Let's talk." Harold ignored him, walking faster down the block. Jeremy persisted, pulling the SUV alongside him. "Don't be stupid, man. I'm offering you a lifeline. You want to sleep on the streets forever." Finally, Harold whirled around, anger flashing in his eyes. "I told you no, Jeremy. Leave me alone." Rain pelted them both, forming rivulets down their faces. Jeremy's face hardened. "You think you're better than me? You're nothing, Harold. You'll always be a bum. Don't come crying to me when you're starving again." With that, he slammed the door and sped off, tires screeching on wet pavement. Harold stood there, trembling with rage and humiliation. He realized that to break free of this life, he had to sever ties with everything that threatened to drag him back down. Jeremy was a ghost from a life he refused to re-enter, but he knew ghosts had a habit of returning. In that same downpour, Mara was concluding a phone call with a contractor who'd volunteered to survey the fixer-upper property. A sense of real possibility was building around the idea of a safe haven for Harold. But if Harold couldn't escape the shadows of his past, would he even live long enough to move into a new home? The clock was ticking, and events were hurtling toward a decisive clash. Monday morning dawned cold and gray. Mara sat in her office, scanning a stack of paperwork for the fixer-upper. The price was shockingly low, almost suspiciously so. But after a thorough inspection, the main issues were fixable with enough money and labor. She had already lined up volunteers for painting, roofing, and basic carpentry. With her professional connections, she could likely secure discounted materials. The puzzle pieces were falling into place. She took a deep breath, then dialed the sellers. After a short negotiation, she committed to the purchase. Her heart pounded with excitement and fear. She was about to buy a house specifically to help a homeless man she barely knew. It was an unprecedented risk, but a deep, unwavering conviction guided her. Her next step was to finalize the financing. She had enough saved for the down payment but would need a short-term renovation loan. That meant meeting with her bank's mortgage officer, explaining a plan that would raise eyebrows. Mara braced herself, scheduling the appointment for later that day. Just before leaving, she got a call from Daniel. "Hey, how's your crazy plan going?" he asked with a chuckle. She gave him a rundown of her progress and he whistled. "You're really doing it, huh? That's pretty amazing, Mara. Do you have any idea how Harold's gonna react?" Her voice grew quiet. "I have no clue, but I know one thing. If someone had pulled me out of that storm a week ago, given me not just a spare tire but a new lease on life, I'd be overwhelmed with gratitude. I think Harold will feel the same." They hung up, and Mara rushed to her meeting. The mortgage officer, a skeptical woman in a neat blazer, eyed Mara's application and listened to the plan. She clicked her pen repeatedly, finally sighing. "We can authorize a renovation loan, but it's predicated on your credit score and some guarantee that the repairs will be completed within a set time frame." Mara nodded, presenting estimates and detailing volunteer commitments. By the end of the meeting, the officer seemed cautiously impressed. "I'll process this as quickly as possible," she said, handing Mara some final forms to sign. "You'll be taking on a lot of liability here, Ms. Larson." "I understand," Mara replied. "Thank you." She stepped out of the bank, rain pattering on her umbrella, feeling both exhilarated and terrified. This was happening. The seeds of a miracle or a catastrophe, or maybe both. While Mara pushed her plan closer to reality, Harold was one unexpected misfortune away from missing out on the opportunity of a lifetime. And as Jeremy lurked in the background, the possibility of conflict loomed. Would Harold's next choices lead him to the home being prepared for him, or would they spell heartbreak? By midweek, the city's weather shifted dramatically to a blazing sun and humid air. Harold continued working with Len's crew, showing up earlier and earlier to prove his reliability. His muscles still ached, but he forced a smile each morning, grateful for any chance at steady pay. One afternoon, he was loading bags of mulch into a truck when he overheard Troy mention a rumor about some realtor trying to help a homeless guy buy a house. Harold listened in shock, nearly dropping the heavy bag. "What did you say?" he blurted, uncharacteristically interrupting. Troy chuckled. "Yeah, my sister's roommate is in real estate or something. She said there's a rumor flying around about a woman trying to buy a house for some homeless dude who helped her. Crazy, right? People think maybe it's a PR stunt." Harold felt his heart quicken. Could it be Mara? The mention of some homeless guy who helped her matched his story, but it seemed too fantastical to believe. He wrestled with the thought, torn between excitement and the fear of disappointment. "Do you know the realtor's name?" he ventured, trying to sound casual. Troy shrugged. "Nah, just said some big-heart lady. Who knows if it's even true?" Harold forced himself to remain calm, continuing his work, but his mind wouldn't let go. If it truly was Mara, why hadn't she found him yet? Did she know he was working here? The questions swarmed his thoughts, making it hard to focus. Later that day, Harold mustered the courage to speak directly with Len. "Listen, I heard a rumor about some realtor maybe looking for a homeless guy who helped her out. That wouldn't be Ms. Larson, would it?" Len eyed him with mild curiosity. "Could be. She came by once, asking for you by name. Left a business card. I forgot to give it to you." He patted his shirt pocket, rummaging until he found it. "Here. Her name's Mara." Harold took the card with trembling fingers. There it was, Mara Larson, realtor, along with her phone number. A wave of emotion coursed through him. He wanted to call her immediately, but he had so little to offer. Would she pity him? Or perhaps she really was doing something extraordinary, and he was too jaded to accept it? He looked up at Len. "Thank you. I appreciate this." Len shrugged. "No biggie. Just don't let personal stuff derail your work. You're doing all right here. I need you reliable." Harold nodded, slipping the card into his wallet. the only item he owned that still held any sense of personal identity. For the rest of the evening, he debated calling her. Finally, once he'd collected his pay, he found a payphone near a gas station. His hand shook as he fed in the coins. Her phone rang. Once, twice, 3 times, then voicemail. Harold's throat constricted, uncertain what to say. At the beep, he blurted, "Ms. Larson, Mara, this is Harold. I got your card from Len. Thank you for trying to find me. I'm around if you want to talk. I work with Len's landscaping most days." He hesitated, then ended lamely, "Thank you. Bye." He hung up, heart hammering. The possibility that she might call him back filled him with both hope and trepidation. He tried to shrug it off and locate a cheap meal, but the adrenaline wouldn't fade. Something told him his life was on the cusp of a major shift, if only he dared to believe it. The voicemail hung in digital space, waiting for Mara to hear it. Would it reach her in time to unite them, or would more obstacles arise? And lurking in the background was Jeremy, that ominous figure who might reappear at any moment to complicate Harold's fragile new beginnings. Mara had just wrapped up a late dinner meeting with a client, returning to her apartment around 9:30 p.m. Her phone, on silent mode during the meeting, displayed a missed call notification. The number was unfamiliar. Her heart skipped a beat. Could it be Harold? She hurriedly tapped the screen, listening to her voicemail. The moment she heard Harold's voice, her eyes brimmed with tears of relief. He was alive, working, and most importantly, he reached out. She replayed his words twice to confirm she wasn't dreaming. Pacing the living room, she contemplated calling him back, but it was already late. A payphone might not ring indefinitely, and even if he was near it, it could be dangerous for him to hang around outside at night. She decided to try in the morning, hoping to catch him before he started work. That night, Mara scarcely slept, too excited by the prospect of finally reconnecting with Harold. She'd set the wheels in motion to buy the property, lined up volunteers for repairs, and begun discreetly collecting donations of furniture and household goods. At last, she could talk to Harold and see if he'd be willing to accept her help. The anticipation was electric. But as the dawn broke, an entirely different crisis gripped Harold. Sometime around 5 a.m., while walking toward Len's landscaping, he caught sight of the black SUV lurking at the end of the street. Jeremy. The memory of their last encounter made Harold's stomach churn. He attempted to bypass the block, weaving through an alley, but Jeremy seemed to anticipate his every move, pulling the SUV into Harold's path. "What do you want from me?" Harold spat, stepping back warily. Jeremy got out, raising his hands in a mocking gesture of surrender. "Easy, Harold. I just want to talk. Word on the street says you're hooking up with some do-gooder who's buying you a house." He laughed, a cruel sound. "You sure you don't want to cut me in on that?" Harold's jaw tightened. "There's nothing to cut you in on. I don't even know if that rumor is true." "Oh, I think it is," Jeremy said, eyes narrowing. "I heard from a mutual acquaintance that some fancy realtor chick is scouting properties for you. Crazy, right? She must be loaded. Why not let me help you handle the money?" Hot anger coursed through Harold. "Stay out of my life, Jeremy. I'm not involving you." Jeremy smirked, stepping closer. "You remember how we used to be tight? We looked out for each other on the construction site. That was real. If you think I'm letting you cash in on some golden ticket without me, you're dumber than I thought." Fear replaced anger. "I owe you nothing," Harold said, voice trembling despite his bravado. "I won't let you ruin my chance at a real life." Jeremy's smirk vanished, replaced by cold menace. "Don't get in my way, or you'll regret it." With that, he shoved Harold hard in the chest, sending him stumbling onto the wet pavement. Harold landed painfully, gasping for breath. Jeremy stared down at him, eyes blazing. "I mean it. he snarled, then stomped back to his SUV and roared away, leaving Harold sprawled in the alley, shaken, bruised, and furious at himself for being so vulnerable. Harold lay there for several minutes. His vision swam, and his heart pounded painfully in his chest. Slowly, he pushed himself upright, wincing at the pain in his ribs. A small voice in his head insisted he should report Jeremy to the police, but he doubted they'd care about two men with checkered histories. Gritting his teeth, he lurched to his feet. By the time he reached Len's Landscaping, it was nearly 6:30 a.m. Again, late. Len's expression darkened at the sight of Harold. "You're late again," he growled. "I don't need to hear excuses. You pull this one more time, you're out." Harold bowed his head, torn between apology and frustration. "I'm sorry," he croaked, bruises throbbing. "Please, give me another chance." Len gave a sharp nod but said nothing more. The rest of the crew loaded into the trucks, and Harold followed, trying to ignore the stabbing pain in his side. As they headed to the job site, he wondered what he'd say if Mara did call him today. He had no phone, no stability, and now a violent threat looming in his life. Could he really drag her into this chaos? While Harold grappled with the physical and emotional aftermath of Jeremy's threat, Mara prepared to make the call that might finally connect them. But would Harold answer in his current state? And even if he did, would the danger overshadow the hope she offered? Mara anxiously dialed Harold's number, though in reality, she had no direct line to him. The best she could do was call Len's Landscaping. After a quick conversation with the receptionist, she was transferred to Len. "Harold? You want to talk to Harold?" he said, sounding puzzled. "He's on a job site. I can't just hand him a phone, but I can give him a message." Mara exhaled. "Please do. Tell him Mara called and I'd like to meet him. Anytime, anywhere. He can pick the place. Just have him call me back. Or if he has no phone, we can arrange something else." Len grunted. "Fine. I'll let him know." He hung up before Mara could express further gratitude. The day dragged on. Mara completed property showings, responded to emails, and tried to concentrate. Her phone remained glued to her side. By late afternoon, it still hadn't rung. Feeling restless, she decided to drive out to the landscaping lot again. If Harold couldn't call, maybe she could catch him at the end of his shift. She arrived around 5:30 p.m., parking near the gate. Within minutes, a battered truck rumbled in, hauling exhausted workers. She scanned the faces as they hopped out. There he was, tall, lean, with a short beard, wearing a navy work jacket. "Harold." She stepped forward, heart hammering. He turned and their eyes locked. For a moment, neither moved. Mara felt an almost tangible wave of relief, joy, and concern flood her. She noticed a bruise on his cheek and a stiffness in his posture. He looked older, more worn than she remembered, but his eyes held the same quiet gentleness that had touched her so deeply before. "Harold?" she said softly, stepping closer. "Mara," he managed, voice raw. You found me." They stood there, the hum of trucks and banter from other workers fading into background noise. Mara wanted to throw her arms around him in gratitude, but she sensed his discomfort. Instead, she gave him a warm, reassuring smile. "I've been trying to find you for weeks. Are you okay? You look hurt." He averted his gaze, one hand drifting to his bruised ribs. "I'm fine. Just a rough morning." He paused, then added, "I got your message from Len." She nodded, scanning his face for signs of deeper pain. "Can I take you somewhere? A cafe? Maybe where we can talk?" Harold hesitated, eyes flicking toward Len, who was busy parking another truck. Finally, he nodded. "Okay." Mara led him to her car. The silence was charged with unspoken tension as they drove. She stole glances at him, noticing the threads of exhaustion woven into his features. She parked at a modest cafe away from the main thoroughfare, hoping to give him some privacy. Once inside, they took a small booth near the back. A waitress approached, and Mara ordered coffee for both of them. Harold sank into his seat, wincing slightly. He looked as if he expected to be judged or pitted. Mara leaned forward, hands clasped together on the table. "First of all, thank you. If it wasn't for you that night, I don't know how I would have changed that tire. You were so kind." Harold shifted, uncomfortable with praise. "Anybody would have done the same." She smiled sadly. "I disagree. Plenty of people drove by without stopping." She paused, then softly added, "I'm sorry I disappeared so quickly that night. I wanted to help you more, but I didn't know how." His gaze flickered to her face. "You tried. You gave me money. That helped." Mara exhaled, relieved to break the ice. "I've been searching for you ever since. I started hearing stories, how you do odd jobs, you volunteer sometimes, or at least try to help people when you can. And I heard you've been working at Lens." He nodded. "Yeah, trying to save up. Maybe get a room somewhere." Her heart pounded. This was the moment to tell him, but she sensed his fragility, worried he might feel overwhelmed or suspicious. "Harold," she began gently, "I'm doing something and it's unconventional, but I want you to hear me out before you decide." He looked wary. "Okay." She took a steadying breath. "I'm a realtor. I found a small house, old, needs work. I'm buying it with the intention to fix it up, and then gift it to someone who deserves a second chance." His expression froze in disbelief. "You mean me?" She nodded, tears shining in her eyes. "Yes, if you'll accept it. I've rallied volunteers who will help renovate. It won't be a mansion, but it will be safe, clean, and yours. No strings attached." A stunned silence descended. Harold stared at her, eyes wide. He opened his mouth to speak, then closed it, shaking his head in confusion. Finally, he managed a hoarse whisper. You can't be serious." She reached across the table, placing her hand on his. "I am. You helped me when I was alone in the storm. And from what I've learned, you've helped so many others, too. Everyone deserves a home, Harold, and I want you to have yours." His shoulders began to quake, and Mara feared he might be on the verge of tears. He pulled his hand away, burying his face in his palms. "I don't know if I can accept that," he whispered, words trembling. "It's too much." Mara swallowed, fighting her own tears. "It's not too much. Not for me, not for you. The community is already coming together to make this happen. All I need is your yes." Harold slowly lifted his head, eyes brimming with conflicting emotions. Hope, fear, disbelief. What if I fail again? I can't even keep a stable job without being late. My life is complicated. She squeezed his hand again. "Then we figure it out. Together. This isn't just about giving you keys and walking away. We'll set up resources, a support system. We'll do what it takes." He stared at her for what felt like an eternity. The waitress arrived with their coffees, placing the mugs on the table and sensing the gravity of the moment. Mara waited, heart in her throat, for Harold's reply. Finally, he exhaled shakily, a single tear trailing down his cheek. "I want it," he said, voice raw. "I don't know how to handle it, but I want a home again." Mara blinked back her own tears, smiling through the flood of emotion. She felt as if the entire cafe glowed with the power of that small yet monumental exchange. "Then let's do this," she said, warmth surging in her chest. As they shared this deeply emotional moment, neither realized the lurking presence that might threaten everything. Jeremy had followed Harold, and now that he knew Mara's identity, the stage was set for a final confrontation that could break their newfound bond or forge it in fire. Days passed in a flurry of activity. With Harold's tentative blessing, Mara moved forward rapidly. She closed on the property, posted flyers requesting volunteer labor, and coordinated donated materials from local hardware stores. Word spread like wildfire through social media and the local news, which caught wind of the heartwarming story. Realtor rallies community to give homeless man new home. At first, Harold was overwhelmed by the sudden attention. People he'd never met approached him, offering congratulations, handshakes, and even small gifts. He tried to keep a low profile, still working at Len's during the day to maintain some sense of routine. Len was bewildered, uncertain whether this situation would make Harold a more dedicated worker or a flight risk. But as Harold's bruises healed and he found new purpose, he became more punctual, more focused. Even his co-workers noticed the change. Meanwhile, Mara navigated a whirlwind of logistical details. The house was in worse shape than she'd initially realized. Water damage in the bathroom, a sagging roof, outdated electrical wiring. Every day, volunteers trickled in with hammers, nails, paint cans, and moral support. Daniel helped coordinate donations, Michelle and Carl pitched in with manual labor, and even some neighbors in the area lent a hand. Progress was slow, but steady. Harold himself was hesitant to swing a hammer at first, uncertain if it was allowed. But Mara insisted. "It's your home. You should be part of building it." So he spent his weekends helping tear out old carpets, painting walls, and learning basic DIY repairs. Each stroke of the paintbrush felt surreal, like he was crafting a future he never believed he'd have again. Yet a dark shadow lingered on the edges. Late one night, while Harold was walking back to the hostel he still rented, Jeremy stepped from the darkness, cornering him against a wall. The smell of beer clung to Jeremy's breath. "Looks like you hit the jackpot," he snarled. "A house, volunteers, the whole city cheering you on. Good for you, Harold. But don't think I'm going away." Harold clenched his fists, fear flaring. "I have nothing for you, Jeremy. Leave me alone." Jeremy laughed, a hollow sound echoing in the alley. "We'll see. Once that house is done, I might come knocking. Maybe I'll let myself in." He turned on his heel, dissolving into the shadows. Harold stood there, hands trembling. He knew Jeremy was capable of violence and manipulation. Would he try to extort money? Vandalize the house? Fear for the future warred with the joy of building something new. As the renovations neared completion, Harold and Mara stood on the brink of a triumphant unveiling, one that would prove generosity can overcome even the darkest of circumstances. But Jeremy's threat loomed, ready to strike at the worst possible moment. The final act was about to unfold, and everything hung in the balance. A month passed in a blur of sawdust, paint fumes, and camaraderie. The dilapidated house underwent a magical transformation. Bright new paint coated the walls, fresh flooring replaced the stained carpets, and volunteers installed modern fixtures in the kitchen and bathroom. Even a small backyard garden began to take shape, courtesy of leftover plants from Len's landscaping. Harold hardly recognized the place. Each time he stepped inside, he felt a mixture of pride, disbelief, and gratitude. The volunteers treated him like a friend, not a project. He shared jokes with them, learned new skills, and even found himself smiling more often than he ever thought possible. Mara coordinated the final pieces of paperwork, ensuring the deed would be put in Harold's name outright. Legally, she was the one purchasing the house, but she planned to sign it over once everything was in order. She kept Harold in the loop, explaining each step. He listened with rapt attention, though the legal terms often baffled him. As the big reveal day approached, Mara prepared a small celebration, a housewarming party of sorts. The community members who had pitched in would gather, share some food, and watch Harold receive the official deed. Local news channels hinted they might even send a reporter to cover the feel-good story of the season. Throughout it all, Harold's anxiety about Jeremy remained. He glanced over his shoulder on the streets, worried the black SUV might appear again. But Jeremy was nowhere to be found. Perhaps he'd moved on or was biding his time. Finally, the day arrived. Sunshine bathed the freshly painted exterior of the house. Folding chairs lined the small front lawn, and a folding table offered refreshments. Mara, dressed in a simple but elegant outfit, greeted volunteers with hugs and handshakes. Daniel handed out water bottles, while Carl prepped a small grill for hot dogs. It was a day of celebration, the air buzzing with anticipation. Harold stood near the front steps, feeling awkward yet elated as people clapped him on the back, praising him for his perseverance. He wore clean jeans and a donated button-down shirt that fit him well. His hair was freshly trimmed, courtesy of a volunteer who owned a barber shop. He glanced at Mara, who beamed at him from across the yard. The gratitude in his eyes spoke volumes. Yet, as the moment of the formal deed transfer approached, a sleek black SUV turned a corner just a few blocks away. The driver, wearing a malevolent smirk, had not forgotten Harold's supposed jackpot, and the final confrontation was about to unfold at the height of Harold's triumph. Mara stood on the porch steps, holding a small folder containing the deed. She cleared her throat, and the crowd quieted. Everyone, I just want to say thank you. None of this would have happened without your generosity and belief in second chances. She turned to Harold. And Harold, this is for you. She extended the folder toward him, tears shimmering in her eyes. Harold approached slowly, reverently. He accepted the folder, his hand trembling. A hush fell over the crowd, broken only by the sound of a single camera shutter from a small-time reporter covering the event. Harold opened the folder to see the official documents declaring him the owner of this home. Overwhelmed, he let out a ragged exhale. Applause rippled through the attendees, many cheering and whistling. He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, struggling to find words. I never thought I'd have a home again, he managed, voice quavering. I don't know how to thank all of you. Mara rested a comforting hand on his shoulder. Just live in it. Make it yours. Before Harold could reply, the rumble of an engine cut through the applause. Heads turned as a black SUV screeched to a halt in front of the house. Jeremy stepped out, swaggering onto the curb. The crowd fell silent, tension thick in the air. Harold felt his stomach drop. Jeremy surveyed the scene with a mocking grin. Nice party, he drawled, stepping toward Harold. Didn't think you'd invite me. Mara stepped forward, voice steady despite her pounding heart. Excuse me, sir. This is a private gathering. Jeremy ignored her, locking eyes on Harold. You gonna introduce me to your sugar mama? He sneered, glancing at Mara with blatant contempt. A ripple of unease went through the onlookers. Carl, Michelle, and Daniel moved closer, forming a protective semicircle around Harold and Mara. We don't want trouble, Carl said quietly, fists clenched at his sides. Jeremy laughed harshly. I'm not here for trouble. I just came to congratulate my old pal. He turned to Harold, voice dripping with venom. You get a new house, new friends, new life, and you forget about the people who were there when you had nothing? Harold tensed, stepping back. You never helped me, Jeremy. You just wanted to drag me into your scams. Please, just go. A flicker of rage flashed in Jeremy's eyes. That's how you see it? He advanced another step. Let's see if your new friends know the real Harold. The one who used to. He never finished. In a fluid motion, Michelle stepped in, planting her hand on his chest. Stop, she commanded firmly. This isn't your stage. Leave. He shoved her away, causing her to stumble into Carl's arms. A collective gasp rose from the crowd. Fury boiled in Harold's chest. He was tired of running from Jeremy, tired of letting fear dictate his life. He took a resolute step forward. That's enough. Harold's voice rang out, startling even himself. This is my home. Get off my property. Jeremy rolled his shoulders, clearly spoiling for a fight. He sized up Harold, a twisted grin curling his lip. Make me. Mara grabbed Harold's arm, trembling. Don't do this, she whispered. He's not worth it. But Harold shook his head, gently freeing his arm. No, Mara, I can't let him ruin this day. He turned to Jeremy, stepping off the porch. The two men squared off on the lawn as the crowd watched in tense silence. With adrenaline coursing through his veins, Harold prepared to defend the life and the home he had fought so hard to claim. Would this final showdown end in violence? Or would Harold find the strength to protect what was his without losing his newfound dignity? Harold felt time slow, the heartbeat thudding in his ears. He remembered countless nights sleeping in alleyways, carrying the weight of shame and hopelessness. He thought of Mara's unwavering kindness, of the volunteers who had poured their labor into these walls, of the small child he'd given a toy to at the supply drive. All that mattered was that he would not let Jeremy tear it away. Jeremy swung first, a wild punch that Harold narrowly dodged. The crowd gasped, some stepping back in fear. Harold, having done physical labor for weeks now, felt stronger than he had in years. He braced himself and delivered a firm push to Jeremy's chest, sending him stumbling. Leave, Harold bellowed, voice filled with raw emotion. I'm done with you. Jeremy recovered, eyes blazing. You're done when I say you're done. He lunged again. This time, Harold braced his stance, absorbing the blow to his shoulder. Pain flared, but he stayed upright. He countered with a punch of his own, catching Jeremy on the jaw. Jeremy staggered, anger morphing into surprise. Carl and Daniel rushed forward. Carl positioned himself on Jeremy's other side, while Daniel stood by Harold, ready to intervene. That's enough, man, Carl growled. But Jeremy wasn't finished. Spitting out a curse, he whipped a small blade from his pocket. The crowd recoiled, a shriek escaping someone's throat. Mara's hand flew to her mouth. Daniel stepped forward, but Harold held him back, not wanting anyone else to get hurt. You think you can scare me off? Jeremy snarled, brandishing the knife. I'll show you. Suddenly, the blare of a police siren cut through the tension. A patrol car screeched up, lights flashing. Neighbors, likely alarmed by the commotion, had called the authorities. Two officers jumped out, guns holstered but hands ready. Jeremy froze, knife still in hand. Ah, you gotta be kidding me, he spat, turning to run. But the officers were faster, commanding him to drop the weapon. Surrounded, Jeremy hesitated, then tossed the knife aside, raising his hands in surrender. One officer quickly moved in, handcuffing him as the other stepped between him and Harold. Harold stood panting, chest heaving. He felt Mara's hand slip into his, grounding him. The officer eyed the scene. Who called this in? Several hands went up. The officer nodded, expression stern. We've got him. Now, who wants to press charges? Harold glanced at Mara, then at the trembling Michelle. Jeremy had assaulted them both verbally and physically, brandishing a weapon. This was the moment to end his reign of intimidation once and for all. The answer was obvious. "I do," Harold said quietly. "Please." He threatened me, assaulted my friend, and pulled a knife on us. The officer nodded. "Understood. We'll need statements from everyone." As Jeremy was shoved into the back of the patrol car, he yelled obscenities, trying to catch Harold's eye. But Harold refused to look at him, focusing instead on Mara's gentle squeeze of his hand. Finally, the SUV's door slammed, and Jeremy's voice was muffled into nothingness. A hush fell over the yard. People exhaled in relief. Mara turned to Harold, eyes brimming with concern. "Are you all right?" He nodded, though his shoulder burned and his knuckles throbbed. "I'm fine. Just sorry you had to see that." She pulled him into a tender hug. "Don't apologize. You stood up for yourself. It's over now." In the aftermath of the confrontation, Harold would face the emotional aftermath of defending his home. And in that vulnerable moment, he would finally realize the depth of the family he had gained. A family rooted not by blood, but by compassion and a belief in second chances. The police took statements from Mara, Harold, and several witnesses. Jeremy was carted off to the station, booked on charges that included assault and brandishing a weapon. A quiet sense of relief and awe settled over the gathering. Eventually, the officers departed, leaving behind a shaken but triumphant group. Carl guided Michelle to a chair, checking if she was okay. She nodded, a little shaky but otherwise unhurt. Daniel helped Harold sit on the porch steps, offering him a bottle of cold water. Mara remained by his side, gently pressing a makeshift ice pack to his bruised shoulder. "You did it," she said softly. "He can't hurt you anymore." Harold stared at the ground, processing the adrenaline crash. "I should have pressed charges sooner. I was so scared." She wrapped an arm around him. "You didn't have the support before. Now you do." He let out a long breath, the tension easing from his body. His gaze swept the lawn, where volunteers and neighbors murmured among themselves, uncertain whether to continue the celebration. He realized then that this group of people, some strangers, some newly made friends, were all here because they cared about him. The weight of that realization nearly stole his breath. "Everyone," Mara announced, her voice slicing through the uneasy silence. "I know that was intense, but this moment is still a celebration. Harold, do you want to say anything?" Slowly, Harold stood up, water bottle in hand, the folder containing the deed tucked under his arm. The crowd turned toward him. He cleared his throat. "I'm not great at speeches, but I want to thank all of you for believing in me, for building these walls, for painting these rooms, for standing by me just now." He paused, voice wavering. "You gave me more than a house. You gave me hope and a second chance. I don't know how I can ever repay you." Someone in the crowd called out, "Pay it forward." A swell of agreement rose in murmurs. Harold nodded, tears in his eyes. "I will. I promise." Applause rippled through the crowd. Smiles replaced fear. Daniel fired up the grill again, and Michelle resumed setting out snacks. The tension dissipated, replaced by the warmth of collective relief and victory. Harold caught Mara's gaze, his eyes shining with gratitude. "Welcome home," she said softly. He smiled back, feeling words were inadequate to express his gratitude. But she understood. She always seemed to understand. The rest of the day passed in a joyous blur. People came and went, sampling the food, touring the newly renovated interior, and offering Harold housewarming gifts. Some brought potted plants, others small decorative items. Carl even handed him a tool set. "So you can fix whatever breaks," he joked, drawing a laugh from Harold. As evening approached, The crowd thinned, leaving only Mara, Daniel, Michelle, and a few others to tidy up. They lingered in the now cozy living room, sipping on lemonade and basking in the glow of the day's triumph. "This house feels alive," Mara commented, smiling as she surveyed the newly painted walls, the comfortable second-hand couch, and the refurbished coffee table. "Like it has a soul." "It does," Harold replied, the corners of his mouth quirking upward. "It's got everyone's love in it." Mara stood, pulling a small envelope from her purse. "One last thing before we go." She handed it to Harold. Curious, he opened it to find a handwritten note and a small key labeled with the house address. The note read, "Harold, welcome to your new beginning. May you find peace and happiness within these walls. Mara." Harold's eyes blurred with tears. "Thank you," he whispered. She stepped forward and hugged him, ignoring the twinge of pain in his shoulder. He hugged her back, letting the tears flow freely this time, unashamed. In that embrace lay a sense of closure for the lonely chapters of his life, and the genesis of something new and beautiful. Though this day marked a joyous milestone, life would continue to test Harold's resolve. But now he had a home, a place that was truly his. And in that foundation, he found not only shelter, but also the seeds of a future filled with promise, friendship, and the unbreakable bonds of a community that had rallied to bring him back from the brink. Epilogue. A light in the window. In the months that followed, Harold settled into his house with a quiet reverence. Each morning, he rose from his own bed, brewed a cup of coffee in his modest kitchen, and smiled at the sunbeams that danced across his living room floor. Some days he still worked with Lens Landscaping, now on a more stable schedule. Other times, he found small side jobs or volunteered at the same shelters that once fed him. Mara visited regularly, bringing small gifts or just stopping by for conversation. Their friendship deepened, rooted in mutual respect. On weekends, Harold tended the backyard garden, growing tomatoes, cucumbers, and even a few flowers. The neighbors often waved from over the fence, greeting him by name. He never forgot that night in the storm when he almost walked by a stranded woman, uncertain whether to help. That single choice had sparked a chain reaction beyond his wildest dreams. As he sat on the porch at dusk, listening to crickets and watching the occasional car roll by, he found it almost miraculous how life had shifted. The bruise of fear left by Jeremy lingered, but it slowly faded like an old scar. Jeremy remained incarcerated, facing charges that might keep him away for a long time. While Harold felt a pang of sadness for the path Jeremy had chosen, he refused to let the man's darkness overshadow his newfound light. A few evenings after finalizing the last bits of the renovation, Harold stepped out onto his porch to see Mara arriving. She held a bottle of sparkling cider, smiling shyly. "Figured we'd celebrate." "Well, everything," she said. They clinked glasses in the fading twilight. "To second chances," she toasted, eyes shining. Harold sipped the fizzy drink, savoring the flavor and the moment. "And to the community that believed in them." Warm laughter fluttered through the air. Inside the house, a single lamp glowed in the window, a beacon of hope in the gathering night. The city lights sparkled in the distance, yet within these humble walls lay a testament to kindness, perseverance, and the transformative power of a single act of empathy. At last, Harold truly had a place to call home.